I want to move to New York. So, bunch of interesting races here. Big headline for Democrats is there was a special election in upstate New York, really seen as a bellwether race. And analysts have been looking towards this one for months now because it's in a district Biden won by a point and a half. It is as swingy of a district as you can get. It's won sometimes by Republicans, sometimes by Democrats. True barometer of sort of the sentiment of the voting public. And you had two candidates, the Republican and the Democrat. Molinaro is the Republican, Ryan is the Democrat, who are both sort of well-established politicians, well-known in the region, so fairly fair fight between them. And the Republican was running almost explicitly on, exclusively on a message about inflation in the economy. Democrat leaning very hard into the new post-Roe abortion messaging. So, Dan, what came out of this very closely watched race?
Yeah, I mean, I think this race is interesting on a number of different levels. But one thing I did point out in my reporting is that Pat Ryan, the Democrat, will only be serving there for 4 months. He's filling a vacancy created by Antonio Delgado, who was picked to replace a New York lieutenant governor who got indicted. And so Pat Ryan is going to be finishing out that term and then running in a different district in November because his home was drawn into those new boundaries. Molinaro is going to be running in that district once again. So that should be an interesting dynamic. This is not one where, in terms of hard numbers, the math of the House was affected, but it gives Democrats an ability to basically say, look, not only did you guys try to make this a referendum on the economy, and we tried to make it a referendum on abortion, but you actually poured in more money than we did. I mean, I don't have the exact post-election figures because some of this stuff just gets sorted out in the end run there. But the National Republican Campaign Committee spent more than $1 million propping up Molinaro, and the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is, of course, the House Republican super PAC, spent another $650,000 at last glance. And of course, Molinaro himself raised $1.5 million, though that was less than the $2 million Ryan raised. The D-Trip, all they would say was that they made a six-figure buy, which usually means 100 or 200, and Vote Vet spent another 500 grand for him. So we're really looking at something like a 2-to-1 Republican advantage in the outside spending at the very least. So there's no question that they felt that this had high stakes, the Republicans. And I think they felt that because after Kansas, after a relatively narrow win in a southern Minnesota special election that in a seat that Trump carried heavily, though one that has been a little bit closer in congressional races, that there's this narrative developing that the great red wave might have crested a little too early, that Democrats are offsetting that red wave with this excitement and appeal to independence that the threat to abortion rights has created. And though I was not on the ground during early voting and election day, what I can say is I actually think Democrats have a real case here that abortion rights was an issue in exciting the base and potentially even in getting independents over to their side, because Mark Molinaro is not actually a far right guy. I mean, period, but especially on abortion rights. He said that it's up to the states. He would not support any kind of federal restrictions. At least that's what he has said. Mm-hmm. He has said that on a personal level, he supports exceptions for incest, rape, and the life of the mother, and that he sort of believes that it should be limited, but in a reasonable way somewhere in the middle. But that said, it's just up to the states. And Pat Ryan was still effectively able to polarize the race and say, this guy has an R next to his name. And at the end of the day, in the abortion rights debate, that's all that matters, because this is the party that has said that they're against abortion rights, and we're the party that says we're for it. There's another dynamic here, which is that since the pandemic, a lot of especially wealthier residents of New York City have moved out to the Hudson Valley, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours north. It's a very beautiful region. uh, homes either in the mountains, the Catskills, or in the valley itself. And I have to think that that has had an impact on the electorate up there in
Mm.
towns like Woodstock, Kingston, Rhinebeck, Hudson, New York, Kinderhook. These are places where there has been an influx of people from at least closer to the New York City metropolitan
Yeah.
area
So
with
you've got people who are like able to work from home now, so they have more flexibility. They can move down a little further, a little better quality of life, maybe cheaper housing, but probably still very expensive. um, so I mean that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing here, you were pointing to that there have been a few special elections now, in addition to that Kansas ballot initiative that obviously swung hard for Democrats, or for the pro-choice position, I should say, because I think there were a significant minority of Republicans who voted for the pro-choice position there as well. But you had Nebraska won post-Dobbs. That was a Trump plus 11 district that the Republicans only won by 5. You had Minnesota's first district that was a Trump plus 10 district, and Republicans only won by 4, so their margin significantly diminished. You had this one, which was a Biden plus 1.5. It looks like Pat Ryan is going to exceed that just by a little bit, not a whole lot, but outperform a little bit there. And then there was actually another special election yesterday in a much redder part of the state that Trump won by 11 and the Republican only won by 7. So you have kind of a consistent trend. And then the other thing that was very interesting to me, Dan, is we're used to pollsters underestimating the Republican side of the ledger. So Republicans sort of outperforming where the polls are. We've now had a couple instances where actually Democrats have been outperforming what the polls are predicting. And this was a really clear example of that this special election. So I'm looking at a tweet from Polling USA, and the polls leading up to this special election, there was Triton polling, had Molinaro plus 10, Data for Progress, which is actually progressive pollster, Molinaro plus 8, PPP, Molinaro plus 3, DCCC targeting, Molinaro plus 3. And then ultimately, so every single poll leading up to this election had the Republican winning, and then the Democrat ends up winning. And, it was fairly close, but it wasn't so close that it's like going to a recount and that the result is ultimately in doubt here. So that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah, it certainly is, and I think it speaks to this question of turnout. I mean, I looked at the turnout in this New York 19th special election. I mean, it looked like something like 130 or 140,000 people showed up to vote in a late August special election. Uh, I mean, I don't think that there were really competitive primaries at the top of the ballot that those same people might have been showing up to vote in
Mm,
otherwise. I think that uh, they managed to get the message out pretty effectively. And in terms of the polling, the only caveat I have to offer on that is that I do know I was familiar with like one or two of those polling figures.
yeah.
It does sort of look like it tightened over time. And
Mm,
so I wonder if the trend line itself was accurate. I mean,
yeah. Could
the
be. Although, I mean, that Data for Progress one came out literally on election day is when I saw that, and it had
oh,
Molinaro plus 8. But well, let's turn to some of the city districts. There was a lot of dem on dem violence in these primaries because you had the whole map is being redrawn. So you had incumbents versus incumbents. You had the Sean Patrick Maloney, the head of the DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Congressional Committee, sort of bigfooting another incumbent and pushing him out of his district. Let's start with one I was actually quite shocked at how lopsided the result was. Carolyn Maloney and Jerry Nadler, and also a third candidate named Suraj Patel, who has challenged Carolyn Maloney in the past. They were drawn together into this district that put the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side in one district together. And they're both longtime incumbents, both like have been there a long time and both, colleagues for years and years. And I think they both chair committees, right? So they're, relatively senior in terms of Democratic Party leadership. And they were pitted against each other in this primary. Nadler just dominated. I mean, it ended up not being close at all. What did you think of that one, Dan?
it was pretty interesting. I spoke to Nadler and Patel yesterday, though Maloney didn't make herself available to the press, and I got a chance to talk to some voters as well. When you look at the dynamics of the race and who Nadler is and who Maloney is, I think Nadler just has a very, very clear and strong brand as sort of this lawyerly liberal. He's the chairman of the House
Yeah.
Judiciary Committee. Much like in the New York's 10th congressional district, just below it, where the winner was a guy who was seen as sort of a Democratic Party hero vis-a-vis Trump. Uh, Jerry Nadler obviously was heavily involved in investigations against Trump, in sort of the impeachment process. I also think that the Upper West Side and generally the West Side of Manhattan tends to be has a higher voting rate than the Upper East Side,
Mm,
and tends to be extremely politically engaged. It's a bit more left leaning, though. The Upper East Side used to be sort of a moderate Republican redoubt. They called it sort of
right.
the Silk
Silk
Stocking
stocking kind of
District,
thing. Yeah.
but now it's sort of just regular rank and file Democrats. But it leans just a bit more affluent, a bit more traditional, a bit more conservative. I know the Breaking Point's producer James Lynch is from there. I'm sure he could confirm what I'm saying. But so I think that's one dynamic. Another dynamic is that she had basically already shown that she just wasn't great at running a campaign, because Patel had run against her twice before, and he actually, in a crowded field, held her to just a 4-point win last time. He
Yeah.
had hammered her for her sort of history of vaccine skepticism. She
Mm,
was somebody who had amplified, sort of saying, having a just asking questions approach to the link
mm,
between childhood vaccines and autism. She used her position in hearings to sort of give a platform to some of these folks. Patel had really initiated that and put that on the map last cycle as
mm.
COVID vaccine was coming online. And then Nadler really took it to a new height by red boxing it, and sort of a red box obviously being the way that candidates signal to super PACs without directly communicating with them, saying voters need to know that Carolyn Maloney is a vaccine skeptic, and a super PAC did come in, spend a couple $100,000
Interesting.
blasting that out there. And then I think Nadler's selling point was, I'm a good liberal. I opposed the Iraq war. She supported it. I supported the Iran nuclear deal, even though I'm Jewish and she's not. She opposed it, and and uh, and essentially saying that he wanted to continue the progress that he had made. That he's this sort of fierce, lawyerly kind of opponent. If you look at her messaging, it was all, you can't send a man to do a woman's job.
Mm,
Um, Say no to the old boys club. And in the very end, it was really nasty. It was like that Nadler's senile. Now,
yeah.
he did have some sort of infirm moments
Well,
in one of the
having been around Carolyn Maloney, I'm not sure she's really in a position to make this case. Maybe someone could, but I'm not sure she's the one.
That's right. Somebody actually said to me, it's the pot calling the kettle black there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, these are both 30-year veterans of Congress in their mid 70s. I do think this
Yeah.
does raise once again issues of Democratic Party gerontocracy,
Yeah.
but ultimately it was an interesting one. And though Jerry Nadler is not sort of a hardcore left guy, I think that the sort of institutional left had rallied around him, seeing him as the best
The better
alternative.
choice. Okay, so let's talk about the one that you referenced that included parts of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, which was this relatively wide open primary. You have this guy named Dan Goldman. He's wealthy, heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, will be one of the wealthiest members of Congress. Very sort of like, standard issue, resistance liberal type of Democrat. Came to prominence because he was a lawyer on the first Trump impeachment and won the backing, kind of controversially, of the New York Times because he's close with the Sulzberger. They didn't disclose that they had a conflict of interest, so they put their finger on the scale heavily in favor of Dan Goldman. And then you had a number of more progressive candidates also vying for this seat, including notably Mondaire Jones, who was a squad member who was kind of big-footed and pushed out of his district by Sean Patrick Maloney.
I would
And
call
then
him
you have,
squad adjacent,
what's
if
that?
I'm gonna.
Squad? We'll say squad adjacent. Yeah, I mean he's ended up being, in my view, rather even more disappointing than I've been in some of the other squad members. And part of why he decided to run in this district is because he thought it would be sort of easier in the general election to win, and he didn't really want to go up against Sean Patrick Maloney, which could have been a more interesting primary. So he jumps into this race. There was another progressive candidate, Carlina Rivera is her name, correct? So ultimately, Yulene New, who represents part of this lower Manhattan district already in the state legislature, the race has not been called to my knowledge, right? It's still very, very close.
Actually,
Goldman has
the
edged.
Associated Press did call it
They did
about
call
one,
it. Okay,
in the
so
morning, but yeah,
gotcha. So it ended up being very close, which, calls into question if Mondaire Jones had run for a different seat, if the left had been able to consolidate behind a single candidate. What, Dan Goldman was able to get 20-some% of the vote or something like that in this district. It seems like there was an opportunity here for a more left candidate that didn't come together, thanks to the New York Times and also thanks to the inability of the left to consolidate around one candidate.
Yeah, we saw this most prominently in last year's New York City mayor's race, where there were
Yeah.
essentially three contenders of one left-leaning flavor or another who took a long time to consolidate. I think we saw a similar effect, though, in the end, that when the progressive segment of the electorate sort of got a very clear message in the final days that this is the person you need to turn to. In that case, it was Maya Wiley. In this case, it's Yulene New. There was some consolidation effect, but the mere fact that there were so many candidates sort of laying claim to that lane in one form or another is absolutely an indictment of the progressive ecosystem in New York City, which, as we'll talk about later, has matured considerably in just 4 or 5 years' time, but is still really not quite capable of sort of laying down the law and reading the riot act to individual candidates. This was obviously a very difficult circumstance. The state legislature Democrats map was thrown out in late April. There was like sort of an initial indication of what the new court-ordered map would look like in mid-May, and then finally in late May, about a week after that, that there was sort of the final maps. And in that period, just of a few days between when there was sort of a draft leaked and when the final maps were released, there was a ton of behind-the-scenes jockeying, especially on the part of Mondaire Jones, who was figuring out not just whether he wanted to run against Sean Patrick Maloney, whose home was drawn into Mondaire's district, and Mondaire's home was drawn into Jamal Bowman's district. So this is, in terms of residency, these things are complicated, though Mondaire did represent a much larger share of the district.
Yeah.
It's been reported at this point that Mondaire looked at that and said, this is going to be a general election toss-up. Biden only carried the new district by just over 10 points. He's not a sort of, he wasn't comporting himself like a frontline member. He was more of a,
ready to run a safe blue seat.
Right.
I mean, how
And
pathetic is that, though, that you're afraid of a Biden plus 10 district? Sorry, but this was Sean Patrick Maloney too. The district that would have been logical for him to run in, which contained more of his current district, was what, Biden plus 7? And he's like, oh, this is too hard for me. I got to run in the Biden plus 10 district.
yeah,
And
something like
this is the guy who's supposed to be in charge of, helping the Democrats keep the House. And he's not even confident enough to win in a Biden plus 6 or 7 district himself. He's got to go and jump into the Biden plus 10 district.
Yeah, very, very bizarre. And certainly in that brief 1-week period where there was this jostling, he took a ton of heat for that. I mean, Richie Torres from the Bronx, again, who is, maybe a mainstream liberal, but is not does not really have a relationship with the organized left, was hitting him very hard because Richie Torres and Mondaire are the first two openly gay Black members, and Sean Patrick Maloney is gay, but he's white and wealthy and moderate. It's hard to think, what a counterfactual would look like, where Mondaire Jones stays in this, sort of prosecutes this kind of case against Maloney that he's put himself above the party. He's nudged out sort of a path-breaking Black progressive. And does Maloney even, say to that, actually, I'll go to New York 18th, the one that I'm currently holding. That's a possibility we'll never be able to know. I think certainly Mondaire's legacy on the left would be less tarnished, and there would be he would at least have everybody rallying to his side
Right.
against Sean Patrick Maloney. And then
Right.
as a frontliner, I mean, look, Katie Porter manages to do it. I mean, she walks a more careful line out in Orange County, California, but it is not absolutely unheard of to
Well, and
win.
Mondaire Jones hasn't been, I mean, to my chagrin, he hasn't been a real like bomb thrower. He's tried to, in a lot of ways, kind of walk a more establishment friendly line. So
He's the
it's not,
freshman represent. He's the representative for the freshman class to Democratic House leadership,
yeah,
and I think that really tells you that he saw himself as being the guy in the room with Pelosi. But
yes, right,
now I happen to think that that works in the suburbs. But yeah, it works in the suburbs, so stick in the suburbs.
right.
And it turns out that New York City people are pretty damn parochial. I mean, I heard it a lot. Like he says he was, he likes the village because he's gay and it was important to him as a young person. That doesn't mean you know the village. That doesn't mean
So
that
people felt like he was kind of a carpetbagger, which he kind of was moving into this district.
100%.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to. I was very sympathetic to him when Sean Patrick Maloney did this, and really did this to both him and Jabal Bowman, and put both of them potentially in a difficult situation. I know Jabal Bowman ultimately he had a primary challenge that he was able to easily dispatch with, but yeah, I mean, now you like sort of sold out the left when you were in Congress, and then you screwed over the left in terms of winning this Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn seat. So I think there are going to be some reflections and some hard feelings there. And then on the other hand, the district that Sean Patrick Maloney did run in, he was challenged by someone who's considered kind of a progressive rising star, Alessandra Biaggi, who had taken out a longtime incumbent state senator who was aligned with that like break off Democratic group that was caucusing with the Republicans and keeping their majority in the session. So she was able to beat that person, I think, in 2018. So she was kind of a rising star, but not able to even come close to getting it done against Sean Patrick Maloney in this very suburban district, which is, sort of like Clinton territory. She beat Bernie in this district. She and Bill actually live in this district in Chappaqua. So too many hurdles for Alessandra Biaggi to overcome there. And I know that's a race you were covering carefully too, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a person who was endorsed by AOC. I mean, when AOC won in June 2018, the state legislative primaries were a couple months later in September, and that's when Cynthia Nixon ran against Cuomo as well. And at that point, this breakaway faction of 8 state Senate Democrats had actually disbanded. Cuomo did it to sort of protect his left flank. He sort of said, okay, guys, enough of this shtick. I don't need you there anymore. Sort of blocking progressive legislation. Now I'm running against the left challenger. Got to quit it. But the Working Families Party and a lot of other folks on the left basically said, we're not forgetting. And they ran 8 candidates against these sort of ex-independent Democratic Conference members, this rogue faction, and won 6 of those races. Hers was the highest profile. I mean, because the guy that she took on was the former leader of that group. He'd also been accused of forcibly kissing a staffer, and she beat that person out. The person had a much higher fundraising haul, and Biaggi has an interesting trajectory. I mean, she worked for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and then she worked for the Cuomo administration, and she became disillusioned because she learned about the IDC and all of that. And subsequent to that, she really did become part of this new crop of hardcore progressives. I don't think she identifies as a socialist, but I think that she worked very closely with people like Julia Salazar, who is a socialist, to do things like strengthen tenant protections. One of the things that I did look at, I mean, you can't talk about this race without noting that Biaggi had to move in order to, or she did move to run there. She bought a very nice house in Bedford, New York, which is, again, of that sort of Chappaqua ilk. By the way, that Clintonian sort of nice Westchester area, that's the most Democratic part of the district. So there are other counties, Rockland, side of the river, go further up, Putnam and part of Dutchess. You start getting into even some Trumpy territory there. But she had that issue that she didn't have these ready-made relationships. There were a ton of progressives who were early opponents of this rogue Democratic faction in the state Senate, and early supporters of Mondaire Jones, including people who told me they would have supported Mondaire against Maloney. People like State Senator Elijah Reichlin Melnick, Croton Mayor Brian Pugh. These are people who were basically overall progressive. They might be called more of the soft progressives than the sort of the hardcore progressives.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically said, we don't know her. We don't have a relationship with her. And they were nervous about her general election prospects. And one of the reasons they were nervous about that is two tweets she put out in sort of the aftermath of George Floyd's killing in 2020. One essentially saying, what do we mean by defund the police? Well, read this article. It wasn't like the most outright endorsement of the defund slogan, but it's there, it's on the record. And then the bigger deal was that she posted a video of Philly cops engaging in an act of brutality against a woman in front of her child and said, the police in this country are soulless. You could see how, frankly, look, what we've seen citywide in New York City, I think that message would have a really hard time playing at this point in time with the uptick in crime and the backlash and things like that. I think it would do well in sort of it would be fine in sort of the socialist redoubts of Northwest Queens and Northwest Brooklyn. And we can get into that when we talk about the socialists. But I cannot think of a single instance of somebody with that kind of baggage winning a general election in what is sort of a suburban light blue
in a potentially tough year as well. Well, I do want to talk about, I think this is the last piece I want to talk about, some of the socialist aligned victories, because I think this was the biggest bright spot, at least for the left, who, there were some missed opportunities at the federal level, but in terms of the state legislature, quite actually a dominant showing from the DSA left in New York here.
Yeah, we saw some folks take over new districts. That would be people like Kristen Gonzalez in Northwest Queens. She happens to be an employee of American Express, but she is a total democratic socialist, and I think will join this crop that I think we could see getting close to 10 people who identify as democratic socialists in the New York State legislature. Wow. And prior to 2018, it was 0. So, and other people held their spots. People like Jabari Brisport in Brooklyn, who had a challenger. There were other progressives.
Well, and I think it's important to note, Dan, that a lot of these folks, I know Jabari Brisport's opponent in particular, were backed by Mayor Adams. So this was kind of a power play from Mayor Eric Adams to put his stamp on the legislature and push out some of the further left factions that he disagrees with, and did not work out well for him. A kind of also a demonstration of his political weakness right now.
I think it is. I think what we've seen is that the power of the machine has gotten, and sort of just general traditional patronage politics, whether in New York City or places like Pittsburgh, I've covered that a lot. It has gotten a lot weaker at the local and state level, where the kind of organizing that DSA does very effectively, door knocking, changing margin, being able to move margins of votes in the hundreds, right, rather than the thousands, remains really powerful. And perhaps also because at the state and local level, when it comes to issues like housing and protecting renters, rental protections, those are easier sells, and you don't sort of get into the kind of federal realm of, oh, what does this person think about Trump, or even the policing issues as much, which tend to be more local. So I should say maybe just at the state legislative level. I think that there was a really interesting race as well in the Bronx, where Gustavo Rivera went up again. He's a progressive, not a socialist, but very firmly aligned with those folks, went up against sort of a Bronx machine candidate, also endorsed by Adriano Espaillat, so who's the congressman from Upper Manhattan and part of the South Bronx, and he defeated her, including in a district that now has the community of Riverdale, which is more affluent, also has a lot of pro-Israel voters. I think you did start to see some outside groups with those pro-Israel leanings intervening there. I mean, without getting into a case by case and going into all of the details, I know it does look like in Central and South Brooklyn, one of these more sort of centrist Democratic candidates was able to hold on, though that person was an incumbent, Kevin Parker. It is still heavily neighborhood and region dependent, but we are sort of seeing a bit of a socialist fertile crescent emerge in Northwest Brooklyn and Northwest Queens, along the water there, where a lot of the young people who live there are just very left leaning, sometimes because they've been priced out of Manhattan and have created these communities there, sometimes just because that's their ideology, and that's sort of where these seats have come up and been created. Obviously, we know that in Northwest Queens, AOC is the member of Congress, so that fits. In Northwest Brooklyn, it's Nydia Velasquez, and she obviously went hard for City Councilwoman Carlina Rivera in the New York 10th primary. She's sort of viewed as one of the older generation of progressive, but not going to really stick her neck out against party leadership. If she does ultimately decide to retire, or frankly, if she sticks around too long, I think that's where people will have their eye on for a new sort of truly left-wing member of Congress.
Yeah. Well, I saw Ross Barkan, who's another friend of the show and also great New York City political observer, pointing out that, just a few years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room if you said the DSA endorsement was going to matter. So even though, it's very small steps forward, the fact of the matter is they're sort of brick by brick building out a real political operation and a real political bench with, established legislators who can then go on and run for those congressional seats and run for higher office. So a lot of very interesting results here. It's never dull, and extremely grateful to you, Dan, for helping us understand all of it.
Always happy to be here, Krystal. This was super in depth, and great time.
Hopefully people got everything they needed to know out of the Florida and New York primary landscape, and also what it might mean for the fall. Dan, great to see you, and everybody out there, thank you for watching. We're gonna have more for you later. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world. So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.